So today we are going to be hearing from Nick Adams, who's the Battle Park manager at the North Carolina Botanical Gardens. So in addition to Battle Park, Nick also manages the Coker Pinetum and the Piedmont Nature Trails. So much of his work deals primarily with invasive exotic management, trail improvement and maintenance, and restoration. Nick received his BS in biology from the University of Central Arkansas in 2003 and his MS in ecology from UNC Chapel Hill in 2012. And due to his background in science and previous experience in native plant landscaping, Nick has a breadth of knowledge about native plant communities and natural area management. So we're really excited to have Nick with us today. And again, we'll have some time for questions throughout his presentation. So with that, I'm going to unshare my screen and turn off my video. And we will let Nick take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm just making some last-minute adjustments real quick so I can have a cheat sheet that you all can't see while I present. So thank you for coming again. I'm glad to have an audience, even though I can't see you. So this will be a first-time experience for me. I'm sure that you all are getting used to the virtual interaction. I am too, but I'm just gonna jump right in here, and here we go. So Forgotten Landscapes, Restoring Battle Park's Remnant Woodland. And so I'm gonna talk today about a restoration project that has been on our plates and on my mind for some years now that we haven't kicked off yet, and wanted to talk about how we go about restoring these plant communities, these native plant communities in the Piedmont and on our natural areas, the North Carolina Botanical Gardens natural areas. So just an overview of our properties that we manage. You'll see in the middle of the slide here the display gardens that some of you are probably familiar with, if not all of you. This is where our education center is and our habitat gardens. The other green areas surrounding sort of give you just a larger extent of the close to 1,200 acres that we manage in Chapel Hill. So Battle Park is of course circled in red. It's part of UNC campus. So you're looking at a map of, sort of the greater Chapel Hill area, or actually a zoomed in section of Chapel Hill. So anyhow, I'm going to be talking about a restoration project at Battle Park. And so typical Battle Park management, as Ben mentioned, I focus a lot on restoration, invasive plant removal. So this slide on the left is demonstrating the flex after a successful invasive plant removal session with some of our student volunteers. And what you can't see behind them is a giant heap of English ivy. And on the right, sort of more typical management activities in Battle Park. These are two of my interns from 2017, Anna Kelly and Andrew Zachman, doing some trail work. So these are our typical, Battle Park management, natural areas management, forest management that we do at the Botanical Garden natural areas. And so, when you think about Battle Park, you think about a forested tract of land, heavily forested. But we also focus in the conservation department, we do a lot of restoration projects where we're thinking about less forested communities, plant communities, and more grass and herb dominated communities with fewer trees. So I just wanted to give you some slides, some pictures here to sort of digest what that may look like. And if you're not already familiar, we use prescribed burns in a lot of these sort of restoration and management activities. And so you're seeing a shot of Penny's Bend on the left, a fire at Penny's Bend. in the upper right, this is at Mason Farm in one of the woodlands, doing a prescribed burn. And that's a nice shot of one of our, well, not active fire crew, but there are some active members on there and some that we wish still helped us out. And so, yeah, I just wanted to point out another example of another natural area that we manage through a cooperative with the Army Corps of Engineers is in Durham County, and it's called Penny's Bend Nature Preserve. So Johnny Randall, pictured here, our Director of Conservation Programs, is clearing a fire line at Penny's Bend in preparation for, I believe, what was the first prescribed burn on the shortleaf pine bluff in 2005. And so the picture on the right shows the understory of this shortleaf pine bluff and what it looked like in 2005. It was very dominated by saplings of various species of tree. So these trees that germinate in the understory are dependent on a lot of shade, and so that's what they were experiencing here. That's why the shortleaf pine looked the way it did, and Johnny thought it would be a good idea, we think collectively, to restore this sort of more open woodland community. And so I'm going to just show you a slide instead of continue to try to describe what I'm talking about. Picture's worth 1,000 words. So that was in 2005 when they started the prescribed burn program on the shortleaf pine bluff. Johnny can correct me if I'm wrong about the year on that, but here's what the shortleaf pine bluff looked like in 2018. So this is after multiple prescribed burns, about once every, I think on average 3 years, maybe every other year to get it started. So a very much more, there are hardly any saplings at all in the understory. And so what we're trying to accomplish here is to allow sunlight to reach the forest floor. And you can kind of see some dappling sunlight here. This is early in the growing season, so you're not seeing the rich herb and grass diversity that is starting to return here. So, some of these other management activities, sort of where I've been going on this vector, is, inspired by the Piedmont Prairie Complex, what we refer to as the Piedmont Prairie Complex, or at least Piedmont Prairie is often referred to. But we view it as a complex of open plant community systems. So I'm going to loosely define these terms that sort of all fall in, under the umbrella of what a Piedmont prairie might have looked like. So a prairie is, as you might be familiar with, you picture the great breadbasket in the Midwest, and you think about prairies, these open landscapes dominated by grasses and herbs, and perhaps scattered with trees here and there. The savanna is a little more tree heavy, but still very much, the understory is very much dominated by grass and herb layer. And then what also falls under that category are these open woodlands. And so that picture of the shortleaf pine bluff, which I'll come back to if you can just try to remember that, that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk about an open woodland. These all fall under the umbrella of grasslands and southern grasslands or southeastern grasslands. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. To further illustrate this sort of continuum in the Piedmont Prairie or the southern grasslands continuum, on the left, we have a nice picture of a admittedly mid-south or midwestern prairie on the left. This is actually Cherokee Prairie in Arkansas. In the middle, the picture in the middle is a Piedmont site, and we refer to this more as a sort of a savanna. I would say this is a more tree-dominated savanna, but still savanna. And this is in Fort Pickett, Virginia. That's a photograph that Bob Pete took years ago. And then in the upper right, we have off of Old Oxford Highway, right across from Penny's Bend, actually, the plant conservation program with the state of North Carolina has been conducting burns for decades now. And they've sort of been, moving in more and more from these sort of more open areas that are already more open, and moving into the adjacent woodlands and trying to open them up with prescribed fire. So that's what you're seeing here, this picture on the right. So prairie, savanna, open woodland from left to right. So I'm going to take a moment here and pause and see if there are any questions so far, and give myself an opportunity to sip some water.
Great. So does anyone have any questions? So Nick, we have one question, if you can remember, from our intro slide. Taylor was asking what kind of tree that was that you were leaning up against in that photo that we had of you.
Well, so that's a famous tree, or famous to Chapel Hill and famous to the Botanical Garden. That's the monarch of the forest in Battle Park, and that is a tulip poplar. And so it's called the monarch of the forest. I'm going to try not to go off on a tangent here, but it was named by Kemp Plummer Battle himself, the former president of the university, who took care of these woods and really advocated for these woods for Battle Park. And it's a big reason why Battle Park continues to be Battle Park today and not developed.
Nice. We've got one more question that came in from Arlene. Arlene was asking, what effect do the burns have on mature trees?
It varies, but in a lot of these systems, especially in the Piedmont, when you have a more mature woodland, as long as it's more upland and say not in a draw or a valley or a cove, if you will, they tend to be more heavily dominated by hickories and oaks. And oaks and hickories and shortleaf pines, for that matter, are all very well adapted to fire. And one can make the argument that they're semi-dependent on fire, or fire tolerant, if you will. That's the probably more appropriate term, because their germination depends on having more open conditions, or at least their continued survival. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. And so remember, everyone, if you have questions that you think of, feel free to put them in the Q&A, and then we'll get to them at points during Nick's presentation. So that's it for now. So I'll hand it back over to Nick.
Thanks. Okay, so we're moving right along here. So I want to focus more on grasslands and sort of give you the bigger natural history picture, so that you sort of have a background for why this is a community consideration, why it's a consideration for restoration, and why we at the Botanical Garden and other plant ecologists in the region think this is an important plant community. So I want to ask this big question: why were there grasslands in the Piedmont, and where did they go? So this first point, we can conclude from climatic evidence, species diversity, pollen records, and qualitative accounts that Piedmont prairie flora were here for thousands of years. So I'm going to go through the ones that I've listed here. I'm omitting one major one, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after we cover these other pieces of evidence. So I'm going to try to move very efficiently through this. So, and we'll have another pause in a moment. So with the sort of assumption and the evidence that climate largely determines vegetation, at the end of the Pleistocene, so what I mean by that is, precipitation and temperature can control what kind of vegetation you see in a particular region. So at the end of the Pleistocene, about 12,000 years ago, the Southeast was covered in boreal forest, at least at these lower altitudes like the Piedmont and the coastal plain to some extent. The mountains in North Carolina were more tundra-like. But as we moved into the Holocene, which we are currently in the Holocene, we started seeing more deciduous trees come into this, move into this area, this region. And this is over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. Towards the middle of the Holocene, there's a pretty significant period of about 4,000 years referred to as the hypsothermal period. And during this period, the climate became more warm and more dry. And so warm and dry climate leads to savanna. This is why you see savanna in other parts of the world. You know, there's a continuum or a spectrum of savanna, but we're talking about temperate savanna here. And that's when grasses, you know, these drought tolerant, and herbs, these other drought tolerant plants started moving into the area. The more recent Holocene, starting at about 5,000 years ago up until now, the climate started to resemble more of what we see today. And so warm still, temperate still, but a little more wet on average. And so presumably the vegetation would respond to that and change. So just hold that thought. And so from species diversity, that's another component. I'm going back to that initial point in the previous slide, species diversity. So what we mean by that is this wonderful book that was published in 2013 by Reed Noss, Forgotten Grasslands of the South. He spends a long time just defending the importance of grasslands in the South, broadly speaking, from, you know, eastern Oklahoma all the way southeast to Florida. And one of the cases that he makes is that, or one of the pieces of evidence that he points out is that, you know, this development of certain prairie important or grassland important species, these genuses, these important components of prairies, there are more species in the Southeast than there are in the Midwestern prairie region. And so that's what this slide is on the right. He has big blue stem, Indian grass, little blue stems, those are all grasses. And then he has blazing stars and purple coneflowers listed as well. And he's comparing what he refers to the prairie region, which is the Midwestern prairie region, to the South. And the number of species is just pales in comparison to what we see in the South. You know, some of that is geographical diversity, but the undertone here is that this diversity, it takes thousands of years to develop through evolution. So it's an important component of why grasslands are here. Palynology, moving down to the second point here, palynology. Palynology is the study of pollen and spores, specifically in deposits of, you know, discovered through archaeological means. And so researchers will go out and take sediment cores from very old lakes and streams, and they'll study the pollen that is buried by thousands of years and feet of sediment. So Delcourt in 1979 demonstrated exactly what I talked about with the climate, that we indeed did see these plants move into the area at the end of the Pleistocene, and especially in the hypsothermal, these grasses and herbs and deciduous trees. We also have qualitative accounts. This is if you're a history buff in terms of, you know, human history, it's kind of fun to think about. There are multiple accounts from travelers in the Southeast, starting back as early as the mid 16th century, describing the Piedmont. If you want to read these quotes on your own, I'm going to try to move a little bit more quickly through this, but just know that it was widely documented that these travelers saw loads and loads of open land in the Piedmont not that long ago. In fact, there's an old map here. There are a multitude actually of old maps, and this is one to highlight. The star shows our approximate location in Chapel Hill. And just to the left of the star, I know that's hard to see, but in Latin it says Grand Savannah. I'm not going to pronounce it in Latin because I would butcher it. But there you have it. Between this mountain range drawn on the map, which you know, it's sort of cartoonish, right? But these are preliminary maps with different technological means, but they document a grand savanna, and this is documented throughout these old maps. Okay, so this component, fire, this is a very significant component to the establishment of these open plant communities, these grasslands, and to the continued dominance and let's just say persistence of grasslands. So again, there's a map of the US with fire frequencies, pre-settlement fire frequencies, and this was from Cecil Frost's PhD back in 1998. And he approximated through fire records, fire scar data from very old trees that, you know, dating up to 250 years, through geological methods, through GPS. He approximated the fire return interval for the Piedmont being between 4 and 6 years. So that means that a natural fire would occur in the Piedmont every 4 to 6 years if we're talking about upland sites that are sort of, you know, not protected by rivers or floodplains or just, you know, other geographical situations that might protect an area from fire. So that's significant. Let's see. So, you know, if we had this frequent fire, this frequency of fire, what happened between 5,000 years before present and now? And so, as I mentioned, the climate began to shift right about then, and that led to more wet conditions and different vegetation favoring. But there were other reasons that the grasslands started to disappear. And so loss of megafauna, grazing megafauna, you think about the Pleistocene, especially the end of the Pleistocene, you think about woolly mammoths and these sort of large megafauna that were throughout this landscape. And speaking of about 12,000 years ago, that's when the first Native Americans started arriving just about in this part of North America. And so between, you know, 5,000 years ago and now, definitely more recently, Native Americans were dispossessed, they were displaced, you know, the land was taken away from them, they were sent to other parts, other regions of the country, and they were nearly exterminated. And so I bring this up because Native Americans were actually very active land managers. You know, they used fire to keep woodlands open in the more recent, in more recent history for agriculture, to keep their woodlands that they hunted in more open, so they could see game more easily, to reinforce the regeneration of plants that they depended on in the understory. And then, of course, coupled with that is European colonization and the shift in land management. Highly agricultural, these lands that were more open were probably converted in many cases to first, you know, grain fields, but then eventually these grain economic grains, if you will, or there's an actual term for that, I'm forgetting it, but things like tobacco and cotton. And so this last term, this last point, the mesification of eastern forests, so that's sort of what I've been flirting with or hinting at, mesification. So our forests moved from more savanna, maybe not dominated, but more frequent savanna, more open woodlands, more prairies, into this mesification, which means that the forest became more closed canopy and favored more mesic species. So on a scale of dry to wet, a xeric species is a species that depends on more dry conditions. So that's where the term xeriscaping comes from. If you're a plant-minded person, landscaping-minded. Anyhow, so this is a subject that's been well covered. Mark Abrams is one of the, and then Greg Nowalki. These two folks that have been covering this particular topic for many years and demonstrated it very well. So, what kind of loss to biodiversity are we talking about? So I can't give you any numbers, but when you think about the forests that we have, these remaining natural areas that we have that are just there to be a woodland in a natural area, and they've been left to their own devices. Something I didn't list was fire suppression starting in the early 20th century. So we allowed these forests to grow without fire management, without trying to keep them open for many decades before realizing that was not great for biodiversity. When you do that, you're shading out the understory, and you are essentially pushing out and taking away habitat for hundreds, if not thousands, of species. So where do we see it now? They didn't completely disappear. We know that they're still here. That's part of what's so interesting about this community to me. And we talk about them as remnant plant communities. So where do we see these remnant plant communities? The most common refugia are these roadsides and rights of way in high quality, these high quality roadsides and rights of Johnny Randall and Carol Ann McCormick and Alan Weekly are 3 botanical garden employees that I know have been working hard, and they're not the only ones. I'm not going to name everybody because I realize I'm starting to think of more people who've been thinking about roadsides for a long time, wanting to protect roadsides and rights of way, wanting to work with these power companies and the DOT to this goes back decades in terms of the garden's work. And we've been somewhat successful, but mostly not. So anyhow, it's a major refugia for some of these species. There are some highly managed sites in national forests and nature preserves. The Botanical Garden is one of those captured here, one of those areas. And then national forest that comes to mind is the Uwharrie National Forest. They do a great job with these sort of open grassland type communities. Military bases, just by sometimes luck. When you have a lot of explosions and a lot of fires caused by those explosions on some military bases, that's great for these open plant communities. So here's a great slide that Johnny Randall put together that just sort of gives you a glimpse of what these high quality roadsides can support, which species, just a handful here. We've got 2 species of Marshallia in the upper part of the slide, a milkweed over to the right, a butterfly milkweed. There's an aster, I believe that's Symphiatricum grandiflorum. Indian paintbrush down at the bottom middle, and then we have wild quinine in the bottom left, and smoothly purple coneflower. Is that what it's called? I'm sorry that I don't remember the exact common name of that. It's a rare, federally listed rare plant that we find is most successful in these rights of ways and roadsides that we have been heavily advocating for, along with a lot of other partners, of course. So again, this is sort of, in my mind, when I think of a Piedmont grassland and savanna, this is again from Fort Pickett, Virginia. This is what comes to mind for me. So we're pausing now for questions.
That's great. Thanks, Nick, so much. Yeah, a few questions coming in. One just from Leslie about what defines regularly mown.
I don't know the answer to that question. I know that the DOT and power line companies used to mow. I'm going to just highlight them because when I think of regularly mown, they're the first that comes to mind, although we at the garden do our own regular mowing. So it depends. So in our wet meadows at Mason Farm, I'm going to start it from a different point, actually. We mow most of our meadows on a rotation. Most of our meadows at Mason Farm Biological Reserve are more wet meadows and less these sort of upland dry fields, if you will. So those get mown about every other year. In terms of the DOT management and just sort of these rights of way managers, they mow as frequently as they can to keep woody vegetation growth suppressed. And so I imagine that when times were different and budgets were perhaps more robust, made for these frequent mowing, I would guess every other year, maybe every third year. When I actually did some research on my master's work involved rights of way and roadsides. And the saplings that I would see on these high quality roadsides that didn't appear to be subject to herbicide use would have saplings growing on these roadsides that were probably 4 years old. So there's an approximation.
Awesome, thanks. I got a few questions here coming in, so thanks everyone for sending your questions in. I'm going to try to get to them all. Cal is asking, is there a higher prairie species diversity in the Southeast, perhaps due to isolation of dry ridges and uplands, which could lead to new species, question mark?
I think species diversity, and then I'll just, from a bird's eye view, species diversity in the Southeast is a little bit higher than it is, say, in the heart of the Midwest. It is. And yes, I think geographical context is everything. So so to think a little bit further east and not think about the Piedmont for just a second, if you think about the coastal plain and the longleaf pine savanna, the longleaf pine savanna is known to have one of the richest species diversity in the country in terms of that one particular plant community. So geographical context is certainly important in terms of these plants adapting to those microclimates and different growing conditions. So I think the answer is yes.
Awesome. Ashley is asking, can homeowners contribute to restoration of the prairie by intentional practices in their own lawns, business places, etc.? And if so, what might best practices be?
Yes, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this because I will just point you to our wonderful website, the North Carolina Botanical Gardens website. That's a driving part of our mission, is to get as many people planting as many wildlife attracting and species, as much of a diversity as possible in their own lawns to help support this biodiversity that is sort of dwindling. And so there are resources surely in every state, but I would look to your botanical gardens. Look for, so I guess the short answer is we're a part of the Center for Plant Conservation. It's a collection of botanical gardens that focus on native plants and conservation. So if you look for them, you can probably find some resources that are nearby to your home.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. One from Sherry, is there a difference between mowing and burning? She has an open native plant area in her backyard and she can't burn, but perhaps mow. Is there a good alternative to burns?
Yeah, I think mowing is about as good of a substitute as you can get. As long as you're doing it, keeping in mind the life cycle of all of your species. That might be a hard thing to keep in mind if you have an extremely diverse landscape. But you want to make sure that your plants can go through their life cycle so that they flower, they fruit, and their seeds mature. Whoever needs to access those seeds, whether it's birds or insects or whatever, can access them before you mow. So we tend to say like an early winter mowing schedule, and you just mow once a year. You could wait even later, say, just before things start to emerge in the spring, late January. But that's a question that if you wanted a specific answer, we could talk a little bit further about that.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. Last question for this break. Arlene wants to know, are the highway wildflower programs using all native species?
No, they are not. This is a subject that has been near and dear to the North Carolina Botanical Gardens mission and heart, collective heart, for many decades. And the short answer is we've tried to advocate for that for years, and so far we have been unsuccessful.
Thanks, Nick. Really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for the great questions coming in. And keep them coming. Feel free to type in the Q&A box there. And again, we'll try to get to them when we can. So I'll hand it back over to Nick.
All right. So Battle Park, right. So we're talking about Battle Park here. And again, if you haven't been to Battle Park, these are some scenes from Battle Park. A very verdant and a rich, well-developed Piedmont forest. So, you know, you may not think when you see, even when you walk through Battle Park, you're not going to think of prairies and savannas when you walk through Battle Park. But there is evidence that some parts of Battle Park were certainly more open than they are now, and probably for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we'll talk a little bit about that to set up this open woodland restoration. So when we're talking about restoration, we often talk about a target. So what are we targeting? What's our goal? What do we want it to look like? What species do we want there? And so in thinking about our target, we're going to cover our current conditions. What does it currently look like at the particular site that we want to restore? We'll look at some historical aerial imagery, which I could spend eons looking at. It's so fun. And we'll look at herbarium specimens to validate the species that are already there, but also species that were documented either, nearby. So here's a trail map of Battle Park, and I have the the proposed restoration site circled generally in red here, and you'll notice some place names on this this map. And I want you to focus on these place names for just a second. So Piney Prospect is one of those. It's outlined in green right next to the red circle, and the Gimgul Castle right next to that. And just keep the Gimgul neighborhood, keep that in your mind as well. And for Taylor, the monarch of the forest is in the upper part of the screen, right below the word battle. That's the location of the huge tulip poplar that is hundreds of years old. So again, here's an aerial view of the proposed restoration site. And just to the right of that, you can see the Hipple Castle site in sort of flashy white. And so this arrow is pointing to Piney Prospect. And you can kind of see a carved opening in the canopy here. But this is just to demonstrate what the canopy looks like right now, at least from, you know, what are we at, 5,000 feet here, something like that. So it's just to demonstrate that we're not really seeing a whole lot of open areas on the ground, etc. But Piney Prospect. So in the history of UNC, which was written by Battle, Kent Plummer Battle, after he retired from being president, he decided to write a history of UNC. It's a very great resource. One of the founders, William Davey, has this quote: "The ridge appears to commence about half a mile directly east of the building, where it rises abruptly several hundred feet. This peak is called Point Prospect. The flat country spreads out below like the ocean, giving an immense hemisphere in which the eye seems lost in the extent of space." And he wrote this in 1793. This was right after he visited Chapel Hill along with a bunch of other folks on a committee to found a university. And they traipsed all over Chapel Hill, and they fell in love with it. Point Prospect that he refers to here is now known as Piney Prospect. And so here's a view from Piney Prospect. This is a photograph that Battle himself took in around 1892. And this is looking east towards Raleigh. The road that you see in the background here or down below is Raleigh Road. It's a dirt road, of course. But you can see the pasture land spreading out. And, you know, if you could pan up in this photo, unfortunately we can't, you could definitely hear what Davey was what was he doing? Describing this landscape. Really, really great photo. What a great resource to have. You know, this is open to everyone. This is a public resource if you wanted to dive into old photos of UNC campus. This is another little collage that I wanted to share with you all. This says, in the middle of this collage, it says students in training, 1917 to 1918. And I forgot to write down the photographer, but it was a student at the time. And she took these pictures of students practicing building trenches and doing other exercises to do their bit for the Great War. But what's important, that's important, but what's also important to point out in this picture is the extent of all of these open spaces. When students were engaging these activities, these training activities, it was all over UNC campus. And there's actually some pretty good evidence that one of these sites was immediately adjacent to the restoration site in question. It's the site of the old site of the chapel for St. Thomas More in the Gimgle neighborhood. So aerial imagery, this is the USDA set out to take pictures of the landscape of the US and basically for agricultural purposes. Pretty great resource, again, open to all the public. Just have to hone in your Google skills. This was taken in April 1938. Battle Park is circled. You'll notice the football stadium just down and to the left. That's exactly where it stands now. I don't know if it was known as Kenan Stadium then, though. Here's a zoomed in version of that picture showing the restoration site circled in red, and the Gimgle Castle circled in sort of an orange here. And if you can make out, the landscape is very much dotted with trees. Now, it was probably by the time the castle got here, or was constructed rather, they probably managed that vegetation, but nevertheless, it's very open. It's a very open downslope from there too. This is what the site looks like currently. It's right along the border of Battle Park. So that's a border marker, a property line marker. This is taken earlier this spring, this picture, and you can see some stuff popping up, but here's another better picture. It'll taken a little bit later, about a month later. You can see needle on grass, Piptochedium abenaceum, popping up and sort of, you know, taking advantage of this dappled sunlight. You're not seeing a whole lot of dappled sunlight though. I mean, there's a fair amount, but we're seeing signs of this canopy closing. So what do we want to see here? What's our visual target? This is along Snow Hill Road on a plant conservation program preserve. They've done an incredible job to open this little woodland up with this little oak savanna, if you will. And this is back at that open woodland, as I mentioned before, on Old Oxford Highway. So we kind of, you know, this looks good, but we'd have to remove a lot of trees. It doesn't seem exactly appropriate, using very soft science, thinking about that. This looks more like the character of what I would expect to see, but maybe even a little more closed than what we want to see. And here we are back at the shortleaf pine bluff at Penny's Bend. And to me, this is a little bit further, well, actually very late in the season, late summer. You can see a lot of composites in bloom right at the, so these white flowering composites right at the middle level of this photo. Lots of grasses developed on this site. And these have all come back after restoration was started here 15 years ago almost. Yeah, 15 years ago. So our site, Open Woodland Battle Park site on the left, and then the shortleaf pine bluff on the right. This is sort of what I envision this site looking more like, with slightly different vegetation. Another pause.
Great, thanks, Nick. So we have 2 questions coming in. So let's start with, we'll do Terry's question. So Terry wants to know, how much do sewer lines interfere with restoration plans at Battle Park and other similar preserves?
The sewer lines tend to run down creek, right next to the creek, especially in an urban natural area. That's a common situation. I don't want to call it a problem because we like our sewer systems. So it just depends. You know, you have to readjust your management goals, I think, when you're dealing with the sewer line, because the sewer company or the sewer authority has to get in there and do maintenance and, you know, other activities.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. And Cal wanted to know that the old photo of Piney Prospect, is that of the Triassic Basin georegion? Question mark.
Yes! Exclamation point.
Awesome. Oh, Cal just popped in with one more question. Penny's Bend restoration. So after fire, did it involve much replanting, or did most of the natives reappear on their own?
For the case of the shortleaf pine bluff, I believe most of those species have come back on their own. There are some cases where we have outplanted plants that we have grown for those sites, but that one, most things have come back on their own.
Awesome. And then one more, I'm going to kind of combine these 2 questions. These just came in regarding the sewer lines. Terry wanted to know, do the sewer lines introduce any invasives that may work against restoration? And then does the open woods make sewer, et cetera, easier because they don't have to deal with saplings?
Yes, the short answer to the first part of the question is yes, absolutely. This is a major issue that we deal with perennially. There's not a great solution to it in terms of prevention. And to answer the second part of the question, the sewer lines tend to fall in sort of those more protected compartments. If we go back and think about the geographical location of these open areas, creek sides and floodplains aren't typically more open like this, unless it's like a scouring community, which is completely different. So it doesn't really provide us the opportunity to do a restoration and manage it ourselves in terms of a more open plant community. I will say we work with our own OWASA. We work with them a lot, and you know, that's an ongoing relationship and an ongoing. We're building strategies right now to try to prevent the spread of more invasives in our floodplains, but it's really hard to do that.
Great, thanks, Nick. Thanks everyone for your great questions. Just want to make a note. I do realize that it is about 12:55 right now. I think we still have a lot of good content to go through, so feel free if you can stick around, because we're just going to keep going because Nick's got some great stuff still to go through. But I understand if people have other engagements, yeah, feel free to kind of sneak out here. But with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Nick. And again, keep those questions coming, and we'll have some more opportunities at the end to answer some questions. So yeah, I'll hand it back over to Nick.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for sticking around if you can. Apologies, I haven't gotten to the many wildflower pictures yet, but guess what? That's exactly where I'm heading. So what's at the restoration site now? Wild quinine is at the restoration site. I haven't seen it flower here in probably 5 years because it's not getting enough sunlight. This to the right, I'm going to pair these, what's here now with these older collections just for fun. So this collection of wild quinine was taken by Joseph Austin Holmes in 1886 at Piney Prospect. So if you'll remember, Piney Prospect is adjacent to this open woodland site. Shaggy blazing star, it flowers here about every other year. It just depends on the year and how the growing conditions are. You know, how if we get a hurricane, I tend to see, if we get more rain, I just don't, it seems like I don't see it love that sort of condition and less drying conditions. Collected the collection to the right, Mary Linda Vardell Smith, 1932, collected on Gimgool Road. So the Gimgool neighborhood was just being developed in this in that time period. Silk grass, I see this bloom every year on this site. There's some conflicting botanical records in terms of which species is actually there. This particular collection taken from the entrance to Gimgool Castle was made by Margaret Jones in 1944. Really cool plant. You know, it's called silk grass because its leaves are very grass-like, and it might appear like a grass before it flowers. One of my favorites, I'm gonna try not to say that 100 times, but goat's rue. This is, I've seen this on site. I've seen the foliage of this plant for many years, and I've seen it bloom maybe a couple times. So again, growing conditions are not ideal here, and it's because this needs to be more open. Along the roadside near Gimgool, collected by Anita Apple in 1942. Kidney leaf rosinweed really is one of my favorites, collected by Harry Allis of the Flora of the Carolinas fame in 1965, collected in Mixed Woods, UNC campus. So Mixed Woods is a term that I think is equal or equitable to open woodland, at least when I see which flora they're referring to here. So what was at the restoration site historically? So site is, there's an asterisk because it may be a nearby site, but not necessarily immediately adjacent to the site. So Radford, also of Carolina, Flora of the Carolinas fame, collected Little Blue Stem on Gimgool Road in 1939, and that's the collection he made. He also collected Arrow Feather 3 on, probably right there in the same spot, same year. I haven't seen these plants near this site or on this site. Rattleweed, I love this this common name because this is a member of the pea family, and when the seeds or the capsules develop, they become very hard and the seeds will rattle around. So if you're walking through this vegetation, you hear a lot of rattling. Collected in dry woods, another equitable term to open woods, I think, in 1917 by Norman Reisner. Slenderleaf false foxglove, Agellinus tenuifolia, collected by William Chambers Coker, 1909. Woods in front of Dr. Battles. So Dr. Battles' house was, as you can imagine, right across the street from the woods they named after him. Barbara's buttons, one of my favorites. I don't know if I've said that yet. And this is an extrapolation because it was collected on dry hillsides somewhere in Chapel Hill, collected by Ash. I wanted to highlight this because William Ash collected this in 1898. And as you all know, he was a prominent botanist, or many of you might know, he was a prominent botanist and naturalist and geologist in the state of North Carolina. Marshallia, there's a collection that was present in Chapel Hill Cemetery, which is a little more specific and perhaps closer to the restoration site, collected by Coker in 1910. I haven't seen this plant in Battle Park in many, many years, if ever. So what's the plan? Those are the beautiful wildflowers we want to see there. And so how do we plan to do that? So the first step is to thin, selectively harvest trees, mostly saplings from the understory, to allow that sunlight to penetrate down to the forest floor, the woodland floor. These are some pictures I just grabbed from the internet of some very light-footed thinning activities, rather than going in there with, a bobcat or, a big truck or whatever. We'll do it by hand, and we'll drag these things around and move the vegetation out of there. Also, seed collection. Seed collection of these plants. We'll come up with a plant list that is a little more robust than what I've shown you today, and see what's going to work there. See if the conditions are going to be favorable for these plants that we have seen there in the past, and plants that we can imagine there. So this is what a fruit looks like I'm going to call that a fruit, and not most people would, of an aster to the left, and then a wonderful botanical garden employee looking for that, collecting it, and then we come back and process it at some facility. Prescribed burns, elephant in the room. Would love to, I guess, begin this activity at Battle Park, but it's probably not an option given its adjacency to adjacency to a neighborhood. There's not a whole lot of buffer between, there's no buffer between the restoration site and this neighborhood. There's a number of protocols that we can go through to make it happen. It probably won't, but there is an option to perhaps just burn smaller tracts, like a 10 meter by 10 meter square at a time, just to do a small burn here and there rather than acres of burn. And so I quickly went through the plan, and I'm gonna stop here and say thank you for hearing me out, and I hope you have some more questions. I'm happy to try to answer some, and I wanted to provide some resources that I think Joanna is gonna put in the chat box as well. If you wanna know more about the impact of the southern grasslands, southeastern grasslands, this is a great place to start, the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative. There's also a more focused group called the Piedmont Prairie Partnership, talking about these issues, champions of conservation and of restoration of these plant communities. And then, of course, if you want to know more about the history of Native Americans in this area and their dispossession and removal and extermination, nearly exterminated, this is a great place to find those resources. So I just wanted to throw that up there too. And with that, I'll just take questions.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. Yeah, we've got a question from Arlene about what do you do with the wood from the harvesting?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess it depends on what we're removing and how much of it we are removing. Sort of a analogous example is we did a restoration, just for example, we did a restoration of a floodplain in Battle Park where we removed literally tons of privet back in 2012 or 2013. And that involved cutting what was essentially saplings and removing them, and then eventually restoring that. We're still working on restoring that floodplain, but we removed them completely from the site because it's an invasive plant. Now with a native plant, I think it just depends on the load. We want to leave some wood there for the wildlife, but we don't want it to, we want to make sure that there's sunlight reaching the forest floor. So there's not an exact science that I've come up with as of yet, but.
Great, thanks, Nick. Yeah, have a few more questions coming in, if you don't mind. The next one is from Leslie, asking if a person wanted a 10 by 10 burn in their HOA, what would you suggest?
In their HOA, gosh. I guess every HOA is different. But I guess you have to start with approval. from your HOA. But there are landscapers out there who are certified in prescribed burns. There's a really great landscaper that's actually, unfortunately, leaving the community, if he hasn't already, soon, Ben Skelton. But I think that there's interest among some landscapers to become a burn boss, a certified burn boss, so that they can do it legitimately. But that's what I would suggest. And if they can't find anybody, I would talk with the Forest Service, the North Carolina Forest Service, because I think that they might at least consult in these situations. I'm not sure that they'll help, but they may.
Great, thanks, Nick. So I'm going to get to two more questions here quickly, and then we'll close out. But yeah, someone wanted to know if opening up the forest aid the survival of Battle Park's identified rare plants?
I'm trying to remember every species and its every rare plant species that we have in Battle Park and its growing conditions. There's definitely at least one species that would greatly benefit from more open woodlands. Yes. I guess the other one that I'm thinking of now would actually benefit from it too, although I haven't seen this other species of loosestrife. I think it's loosestrife, Lysomachia. I can't remember the common name for that genus, but yes, that would benefit as well. I haven't seen that plant in years now, so that would be an interesting case study to try to find nearby existing populations and try to grow them from seed, collect seed, grow them from seed, of course, with all the appropriate permissions, because there's a very rigorous process for that, and appropriately rigorous.
Awesome. So we'll take this will be our last question here, and I know Joanna posted in the chat. If y'all have other questions that you want to follow up with, feel free to email Nick. I know he'd be more than happy to answer any questions. But the last question coming from Cal: could open woodland be more "quote unquote" people friendly than the present habitat at the Gimghoul site?
More people friendly. I am going to make an assumption here that you're talking about the privacy for Gimghoul, the Gimghoul Castle and the Gimghoul Society. For those who don't know, the Gimghoul Castle is a structure that is used by a society that likes to remain very private, but because it's a castle, it gets a lot of attention. My initial thought about opening the woods a little bit more and therefore making the castle more visible would probably not excite them. But I also think that the notoriety, well, not notoriety, maybe notoriety, but the fame is already there. People already know about the castle. People who want to see the castle are driving to the castle. It's not like they're walking by in the neighborhood and say, oh, there's a castle. Maybe a first-time Battle Park visitor, if they're looking at a map, might have the same curiosity. But in this situation, you know, there's just a certain amount of, unless you put a giant fence up around your castle, people are going to be curious about it. So I hope that answers your question, if that's what you were referring to.
That's great. Thanks so much, Nick. And for those who have more questions, feel free to reach out to Nick. Again, if y'all have feedback on our virtual Lunchbox Talk series, feel free to email myself or Joanna. Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing all your knowledge and for this awesome presentation today. And thanks for all of the attendees for joining us over your lunch hour and sticking with us. After you close out of this webinar, you'll be redirected to a survey. If you could take a moment and fill that out, that really just helps us out in getting feedback and figuring out how to make these programs better, and for different ideas that y'all have. There's some links in the chat. If you can, join us on our next Lunchbox Talk on the 11th of June, and for the Carolina Moonlight Virtual Party on the 6th of June. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everyone. And thanks again, Nick, so much for hanging out with us. And
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks for everyone for attending. So bye, everyone.